We're on Daf Tzadi Zayin Amid Beis, and we're looking at the Mishnah. Just a few principles that operate here as an introduction to the Mishnah. Principle number one is that if a woman, a non-Jewish woman, is misgayer, then the children that she has are related to her. So if you have two brothers, for example, that were born to a woman after Gerus, who underwent Gerus, then they're krovim through the mother. That's maternal brothers. That's not going to be relevant to Yibum. Principle number two is that any Iser Erva that applies when they were Goyim would midrabanan apply even after Gerus, even though Gekatan Chenolad Dami, but we're going to continue those Isurim because we don't want to go from what's called a Kedusha Kala to a Kedusha Chamura and then lower the standards. So those Isurei Arayos that applied when they were Goyim will still continue to apply. And finally, the third principle is that when you have Arayos that are what's called Machmas Achva, as a result of Achva, we'll see what the concept of Achva means, then sometimes on a Drabbana level, there will be an Iser Arayos Yisrael. And Mirabanan, those Isurei Arayos that are the Yisrael Machmas Achva, sometimes Gazru Gamaleim, they would also be included in this Gzerim. All right, so let's begin the Mishnah without any further ado. Hagiores Shenizgairu Boneha Imam. So we're talking about a non-Jewish woman who has children, and there's a family gerus, which means that she brings her children together with her for gerus. Now these gerim, the children, after their gerus, they marry women, Jewish women obviously, and one of them dies without children. Lo cholzin v'lo miyabin. The brothers will not require neither chalitza nor yibum with regard to the almana, the widow of the dead. And right now, we can explain, as we did before, the same underlying principle, namely that they're not considered achim min ha'av, right? Their father was not Jewish. They're only achim min ha'em. Their mother is Jewish, and there's no yibum in achim min ha'em. But the Mishnah goes one step further because we didn't address the question exactly when this gerus was chal. There are different stages. And afilu horaso shel rishon shelo b'kedusha v'leidaso b'kedusha. In other words, while she was pregnant, this non-Jewish woman, she underwent gerus. And therefore, the gerus of the mother is chal, even vis-a-vis the fetus. So that when the fetus is born, that's called leidasa b'kedusha. V'hasheni hora'asa v'leidasa b'kedusha. Let's say that she underwent gerus before she became pregnant. So the first child that she has, one child, I should say, that she has, was hora'aso shelo b'kedusha. Her gerus took place after she became pregnant. The other was hora'aso b'kedusha, which means that she underwent gerus before she became pregnant. What's common to both of these siblings are they both have leidaso b'kedusha, but one of them has hora'aso b'kedusha, the other is hora'aso shelo b'kedusha. And the Mishnah is telling us that even in that case, they're not considered achim, they're not considered brothers, because their brotherhood is maternal only through the mother. And therefore, there is no chiyuv yibum on the brother, because yibum is a result, as we've discussed on many occasions, of achim min ha'av. So that ger, who is horaso shelo b'kedusha, meaning that if I could use the term, the zera that was responsible for creating him, the zera ha'av, was shelo b'kedusha. There's no way, therefore, he could be related to any biological brother whose zera was b'kedusha, because his zera was shelo b'kedusha. That's called haraso shelo b'kedusha. All these dinim that we mentioned above apply equally to a shivcha, in which case that she plus her children experience shichrur, which makes them into gerim, because we're talking about, of course, the shivcha. And these are the same laws of gerus that operate with regard to the shivcha as they do with regard to a regular Jewish woman. To a regular non-Jewish woman who undergoes conversion. The Gemara now tells the following story. B'nei Yudin Amsa. So we're now talking about a shivcha whose name was Yudan, and her children, Ishtachur, they became gerim through shichrur. Sharlahu, he was matir them, Rabbi Acha Bar Yaakov, lemitzav nishei dahadodi. So imagine, these are two biological brothers. They were each married, and now after the shichrur, which means after the gerus, Rabbi Acha allowed them to marry the wife of their brother, their own sister-in-law. It's almost like swapping wives. And the reason for that is because these brothers are not considered krovim zelazeh after gerus, which is the famous super principle of Gershon Iskai Kakot Chenolad Domi. And hence, he's not marrying Eshes Achiv. This is not Achiv. Amalei Rava. Rava says to Rav Acha, or Rav Sheshes Osar, in exact this circumstance, Rav Sheshes says, you're not allowed to marry this ger, is not allowed to marry the wife of his brother. And the reason for that is because since that was also as they were goyim, it remains also even after gerus. Amalei, so Rav Acha responds to Rava, who osar v'anach shrina. You know, he's entitled to his opinion. And Rava, you know, it's very nice that Rav Sheshes, you know, was machmir, but I, Rav Acha, I am sharina, I'm matir. And I insist that, you know, my opinion should be accepted. And Rav Sheshes is entitled to his opinion. Apparently, and this is what the Ritva adds here, Rav Acha, was so convinced that he's right, he had bias, that therefore he wasn't dispoiled when Rava told him that Rav Sheshes was machmir. So what is now the machlokes between Rav Acha and Rav Sheshes? We have gerim that are brothers with a common father, but not with the same mother. That's one scenario. And in that case, Kuliyamalo pleaded shari. Even Rav Sheshes would concede that it's mutter. Everybody would concede that it's mutter. Each one would be permitted to marry the former wife of his brother, and it's not an Erev of Eshes Ach, because in this case, they are not considered brothers, because they don't share the same mother. And in this case, we're not choshesh that they'll come to be matir in the case of Yisrael for a person to be allowed to marry the wife of his brother, because it'll be absolutely clear to them that the reason why this ger is allowed to marry the wife of his brother is because Haim Enam me Osoha'a. Why? Why is it Haim Enam me Osam Ha'av? After all, we're assuming that these are brothers. You meet John Paul Jones, and he has two sons, Tommy and Harry, and we assume they're brothers. But no, the halacha doesn't assume they're brothers, not even paternal brothers. And why is that? This is a principle called, again, you can't publicize this, but Stam Oved Kochavim, or Ovedes Kochavim, Hi Zona, that the non-Jewish people live a loose kind of a life, and she may have had relations with different men, and we don't know who the father is. Therefore, we assume that these two gentlemen, Dick and Harry, Tom and Harry, are not brothers. So therefore, the people are going to say that the reason why they're mutter, and you could allow them to marry the wife of their brother, is because we don't believe that they're brothers. We don't believe that they have a common father. However, let's go on to another scenario. And that's mina'em v'lo mina'ah. These are two brothers that clearly come from the same mother. In this case, you can't fool anybody. You could say in the case of the Av, we don't know who Zerah was responsible for the birth. They didn't have DNA tests. But in the case of Mina'em, we know that their brother's Mina'em. She gave birth to both of these. And they're not considered brothers Mina'av. Again, there's going to be no machlokas about that. So the Gemara is really clearing the pathway for the machlokas between Rav Acha and Rav Sheshes. Is Kuliyamalo Pligi De'asa. Everyone's going to agree that in this case, you cannot allow him to marry the wife of his brother, because in the eyes of the public, they look like Achim Gemurim, total brothers, because they were born to the same mother. And therefore, if you allow, in this case of the Gerin, to marry his brother's wife, then people will come to think that even a Yisrael is allowed to marry his brother's wife. When is the machlokas between Rav Acha and Rav Sheshes? That's going to be the case of Gerim min ha'av u'min ha'em. They share l'chora the same father and the same mother for sure. They share. Man deshari, according to Rav Acha, he was the lenient makil. He was matir them in that situation to be makadesh, to marry Eshes Achiv, and he's not willing to accept a gzera that they might come to be matir, even in Eshes Ach, in the case of Yisrael, Shebasar Abba Shadina. They go by the father. In other words, they know that they are brothers from the father. It's not public knowledge that they're also brothers from the mother. Interesting. Today, you walk out of a hospital with documentation, you were born to so-and-so, and they wrap it up around the child's, wrist and everything. But in those days, the birth process took place in private, and it wasn't a public matter. And it's very possible that people knew who were the sons of so-and-so, again, in the Goyish world. They didn't know if they shared the same mother. That was not public knowledge. Because when they named a guy, they used to give him the name after his father, meaning he is the son of so-and-so. And therefore, in general, when you talk about the brios, meaning the public at large, they call two brothers brothers because they share the same father. And therefore, we don't have a chashash here, because since we have that principle that we mentioned earlier about Stamo Vedes Kolchabarei Kizona. Therefore, if you allow them to marry Eshes Ach in this case, they're not going to come to any mistaken conclusions about Eshes Ach Yisrael, because they know the dinim with regard to identifying a father in the case of a guy are totally different. And that's going to be the leniency of Rav Acha. But Rav Sheshes, he says, Kari la nami b'nei plonis. when you register your name, in the Ministry of local residents, they don't only ask you for your father's name, they ask you for your mother's name as well. That's also on the documentation, like a date of birth or a record of birth. So therefore, since in the Brios, the people at large, they call them the B'nai Plonis. And not only that, they know that, she gave birth to these two children. Therefore, when the Brios see that you're allowing them to marry their brothers' wives, they're going to be makil, even in the case of Yisrael. Because there's no reason why the dinim should change if they both came from the same mother. If they came from the same father, in quotation marks, then we don't have a chach. Because then the people are going to understand full well that has to do with znus. And they're not the same father, therefore they're not brothers. But in a case where we know and the people know that they came from the same mother, that's where Rav Sheshes steps up to the plate and he says we have to be machmir, because if you allow Eish Ach in that case, people will think that even in Yisrael, Eish Ach is mut. Ikar the Amri. Now we have a second transmission. Ligi Rav Acha Bar Yaakov Afilu Bi'achim Mina'im. Machlokes between Rav Acha Bar Yaakov is even in the case of two brothers that came from the same mother. And nevertheless, Rav Acha took the lenient ground and he was allowing each one of these two brothers after Geras to marry his brother's wife. My time, and why isn't Rav Acha worried about a Gzera? And the answer is Gershon is Gai Chanol Adam. In other words, even if they were related to each other while they were Goyim, but Me'ata, from now on, after Geras, they're no longer related to each other. And no one's going to become to be matir. No spectator will be, there's no suspicion that a spectator will come to be matir in Eishes Ach. Because they know that the reason for this heter is a special reason, a special unique halachic consideration in Gerim, because Gershon is Garik and Kotan Shenoladam. Now the Gemara wants to see if we can come to some final halachic decision regarding this machlokas. And our Mishnah here says, Hagiora Eshet is Gairu Banea Ima Lo Cholzin V'lo Miyabim. If you have a woman a non-Jewish woman who undergoes Gerus, and her children likewise join her and undergo Gerus, then if one of these two brothers dies, there's no need for Chalitza or Yibum. My time olav mishum dasir. Shouldn't we assume that the reason why there's no Yibum in this case is because Asiri, they're not allowed to marry the wife of their brother because they are brothers from the same mother. So that the Isser Erev of Eishes Ach applies even to brothers who are maternal brothers and not paternal brothers. And our Mishnah is coming to Mechadesh that any one of these Gerim who are maternal brothers is enjoined, he's not allowed to marry the wife of his brother. Therefore, lo cholzin v'lo misyabim. So the Gemara wants to bring a raya from our Mishnah that Gerim who are Achim and Achim and Aim, are not permitted to marry Eishes Achim. And that's exactly why the Mishnah paskins in that same scenario that lo cholzin v'lo miyabim. Now keep in mind that on a technical level, there's no yibum here because they're not achim and a'af. But on the other hand, let's see what the law would be as far as the Erev of Shesach is concerned. So let's forget about Yibum. Yibum is out of the question here. They don't share the same father. But are they considered Achim? And would we allow them to marry the other one's wife? Obviously, after she gets divorced or widowed. And the answer is that that's exactly what the Mishnah wants to come to be Machadesh. The Mishnah, although it seems to be addressing the laws of Yibum and Chalitza, that's just a guise. Don't be fooled by that. The real underlying principle that the Mishnah is trying to convey is that Achim and A'im can, after Gerus, cannot marry each one and the other's wife. And that would seem to tip the scale in favor of the first Lishna in this machlokas between Rav Sheshes and Rav Acha. And that is that in the case of Achim and A'im, Kuliyam lo pli yidiyos. Whereas according to the Ika Diamri, Rav Acha bar Yaakov was Mekil even in the case of Achim and A'im, because of the principle of Ger Katan, etc. So our Mishnah would support the version of Rav Acha of the Lishna Kam. Lo, the Gemara deflects this proof. When the Mishnah says, Lo choltzin v'lo miyabnim, it's focused totally on the laws of Yibum. And it's coming to tell me the Eina b'toras chalitza v'Yibum. To be mechadish to us that even though we think that they came from the same zera, meaning they're brothers from the father, no. They are not brothers with the same common father. And therefore these women are allowed to marry anyone they want without Yibum and Chalitz. There's no Yibum and Chalitz, there's no Zika, there's no Losia Eish Samei Sachutz Lish, because they don't have the same father. The Inunami Shari. And the living, surviving brother is mutter. So the Gemara says, wait a second. Let's look at the Sefer of the Mishnah. Vaktani, in the Sefer of the Mishnah, it says, Afilu. Okay, let's spend a minute on the Afilu. Afilu was the case where one of the two brothers was Hora'aso Shalo B'Kedusha. Both brothers were Leidaso B'Kedusha. But one of the two brothers was already in a fetal stage when his mother was miscarried, so therefore it's Hora'aso Shalo B'Kedusha. And in such a case, there's not going to be any Yibum. Lo Choltzin V'lo Miyab. Now, the Mishnah added the word afilu. Afilu horaso shel rishon shelo b'kedusha. That's the chiddush. That even though there's a difference between the two brothers in horasam, nevertheless p'tura michalitza v'yibum. Now, what's the chiddush here? That even though they had the one brother had a rasa shalobik, despite that, there's no yibum and chalitz. It's counterintuitive because harasa shalobik is a reason to undermine chalitz and yibum. So you tell me, no, even in that case, there's no chalitz and yibum. If you're going to tell me that two brothers that share the same mother, Asiri, they're not allowed to marry Eshes Ach, and that was the original proof that the Mishnah's Lo Chotz Lo Miyabim is teaching me. That forget about mitzvahs yibum, even leave out the question that there's no mitzvah. For sure, there's no mitzvah, but it's an isur liyab. And that's exactly what we wanted to prove from the Mishnah. That in Achim and Aim, there's an Isur to marry his brother's wife. Hainu diktani, therefore the Sefer, the Ezra Afilu. The Afal gav the Rishon, Horasa Shalo Bikdusha. V'lei Dasa Bikdusha, Hasheni Horasa, V'lei Dasa Bikdusha, Kishtei Imots Tamu. Right, the first one was conceived Shalo Bikdusha. So his mother, so to speak, it talked about conception in the ovum. Well, that took place when she was a goyet. Whereas the second child, he was conceived after his mother was already a Gioris. And therefore it's Kishtei Mo's dam. Right? It looks like these are two sons who have two different mothers. Right? There's no Horasa Shana because one of them came from the mother Goyet. The other came from the mother, a Jewish woman. So therefore they're not considered to have been born to the same mother. They're considered to have been born to two mothers. It's Afilu Hachi Asiri. We're still going to institute that Zera Otu in Yisrael. They might come to be Matu Neshis Af. Even though, in truth, these two brothers are not brothers at all. That's a big Kiddush, that you have two brothers that are not related to each other. Because Ger Kikodesh and Oladami, therefore they're not related to each other. And yet we still have a Gzera. If we allow him to marry his brother's wife, they'll think that Eishes Ach is mut. Even in a case where halachically they have two different mothers. Now we'll go according to the second Mishnah of Rav Acha. That even in the case of two brothers from the same mother, we could be mat to them to marry respectively each other's wives. And when the Mishnah says lo choltzim lo miyabim, it's telling me that there's no yibum and chalitza, and she's muteres l'shuk. Then we'll ask you the question, Maya filu. What's the lashon of the Mishnah filu in the Sefer? In the case of Arasa Shal Rishon Shalom B'Kedusha Lidas B'Kedusha Arasa V'Lidas Shal Sheni B'Kedusha. With regard to the heter of an Isha l'shuk, that she doesn't need yibum chalitza, so there's no greater chiddush in the case where they look like they're coming from two different mothers, above and beyond the case where they look like they're brothers, they're brothers and sisters from both the same mother and father. Sharei below din zeh, even without the din of yibum, and yibum is totally be achva mina av, is there for the word afilu doesn't make any sense. I want to go over this one more time. The Maya Filu. We're now going according to that opinion that we're going to allow him to marry Eishes Ach after the Gerus, and Lo Choltzen Lo Miyabnim is coming to teach me that she's Muteres L'Shuk without Yibum and Chalitza. So what's the afilu then? What do you mean? She's mutala laseis lechutz, even in a case where it was horasa shlobektush and it doesn't look like they have the same mother. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. That's not an even. That's more of a pshita than an afilu. Now, if you're looking for reasons why there shouldn't be a gzera of Eishes Ach, then Adarab will point out that it was horasa shlobektusha. But don't tell me afilu horasa shlobektusha, because afilu horasa shlobektusha is more of a reason that pushes us towards being mater holashuk. Because there's no equation between the two brothers. So the Gemara rejects this. it's possible to explain the word afilu in the Seifa, even if we assume that gerim that have the same mother, their achim and aim, are allowed to marry each one's wives, which is the second Lishna in Rav Achla. And what chiddush is the Mishnah adding to me in the Seifa with the word afilu? The afal gav the travayu, both of them are leidasa b'kedusha. So if they're leidasa b'kedusha, then they look like full-fledged achim gemurim, and therefore we should be choshesh that if we allow them to get married bashuk, allow her to get married bashuk, then without requiring yibum or chalitza, is asi lechlufe b'Yisrael, right? Lahachluf lahata b'Yisrael, Yevamot lashuk. Because again, since it was both leidasam b'kedusha, they look like achim, and they look like achim, and now you're going to let her go out free without yibum or chalitza. People will say that there's no isur of shuk, which I guess means that yibum is just an option, but she can get married to anyone. And that's the lashon asi lechlufi b'Yisrael sheyavo lahatir af b'Yisrael Yevamot lashuk below yibum below b'chalitza. Because again, they look like perfect brothers, complete brothers. They were both late nasa b'kedusha. Afilu hachi, the chiddush is sharu, that they didn't institute such a tzera. She's allowed to marry to the shuk without yibum v'chalitza. And we're going to assume that everybody understands that the reason for this heter is because we're talking about gerim. And in gerim, the halacha is there's no yichus to the father. We don't assume that they're both brothers from the same father. And if so, there's no yibum and there's no chalitza. But that has nothing to do with the case of two brothers, one of which died without children, and his wife falls for yibum to the other brother. I mean, in that case, there's no concept of ger eino misyaches esalavim. Ika diamri. Now we have another lishna, which we're going to bring our mishnah as a proof, just the opposite. Buk fakir. Hachi nami mistabra that shar. You're right. I'm not going to argue with you. It's more of a reason and a logical indication that gerim who are achim min ha'em, that they should be allowed to marry one of the other, even if they had the same leda b'kedusha. The Katani afilu in the Sefer says afilu, even if Horasa Sharisha was b'kedusha leidasa b'kedusha, Hasheni Horasa leidasa b'kedusha, nevertheless l'chol tzula b'yam. So what's the afilu? There's a chiddush that even though the horasam shala'achim eina b'shava, nevertheless p'turim mi'chalitza of the. But what's the logic here? That even though they had a different hora, nevertheless, there's a p'tur from chalitza and yibum, and that's counter-logical. Is iyamrit b'shleimat sharu. If you're going to tell me that you have gerim achim min ha'em, they're allowed each one to marry their brother's wife, and the Mishnah of Lo Choltzin Lo Miyavim is telling me that she is muteris, therefore a shuk without yibum and chalitza, then hainu diktani. Now I understand the word afil. The afal gav the travayu leidasam b'kedusha, even though both. Even though both of these brothers had a leda b'kedusha, and therefore if we be mated in the shuk and they look like brothers, asi lechlufi Yisrael, and they'll be mated Yisrael, even though she has a zikas even to marry someone from the shuk without yibum v'chalitza, afilu hachi sharet. Nevertheless, it's mutter. She's allowed to marry someone from the shuk because people know that the heter is a special heter for gerim because ger shenolad is not misyaches. It's not misyaches to his father. So there's no achva minah. And yibum v'chalitza depends on achva minah. And we're not choshesh sheyavo lahatir b'Yisrael ishas kuka liyivum l'shuk below yibum v'chalitza because again, as we said earlier, people understand that the sivas haheter here in gerim is because there's no yichus to the father. So all this makes sense if you assume that we're talking about achim min ha'em v'lo min ha'av. And the chiddush is that there's no zikas yibum and she's muteres l'shuk. And the afilu is that even though they had a later v'kedusha, which indicates that they are brothers, and therefore you might have Asi Lachlufe with Yevamot l'shuk. No, we're not chochesh for that. But if you're going to go with the assumption of the first Lishna, or the Shita of Rav Sheshes that it's offer to marry his brother's wife, and then we interpret the Mishnah of Lo Choltz V'Lo Miyabmin as an Iser Yibum, is my afilu. What's the chiddush in the sefer that the Mishnah says afilu? Since in the sefer we're talking about a case of leida shnei and b'kedusha, that would be a siba lesser loss. So why do you say afilu? They are achim min ha'em. So the Gemara rejects this. It's possible to say that we could justify the language of afilu in the sefer, even if we're going to say that gerim who share the same mother are asurim, like Rav Sheshes asurim loseis kol echad es eshes achiv. And what's the chiddush of Mishnah? The afal gav the rishon or rasa shlo v'ktucha v'leidasu v'ktucha asheri or rasa v'leidasu v'ktucha shtei kishtei mos dami afilu hachi asiri. That even though you would say they look like they're coming from two different mothers, and again, as far as the fathers are concerned, people realize that we have that principle that we mentioned before about snus. And now it looks like they have two different mothers because one was born to a mother who's a Goya, or at least the Hora was right to a Goita, and the other was to a Jewish woman. So they don't look like brothers min ha'em. And nevertheless, we're still going to say that Asiri. You would have thought that here we should be matir, each one to marry his brother's wife, because they don't look like brothers at all. But the Mishnah is macharish that afilu hachi Asiri, because at the end of the day, they are, at least biologically, both brothers from the mother, and also they were both born b'ktucha from the same mother. So I just want to go back for 1 minute to review the Mishnah. Right, afilu, etc. They're considered brothers min ha'em. Which now is interpreted not as halacha in Yibum, but rather as halacha in Ervas Eishes Ach, and it's us. So lo miyabim means, it's a funny way of interpreting the words lo yabim. We assume lo yabim means halacha in Yibum, that's lo yibum. No, lo yabim means they're not allowed to marry. because of the Isser of Eshesach, and we're afraid of that it looks like Eshesach, because they share the same mother, and we should be gozer me to Yisrael, that they might be matreshes. Toshma, now the Gemara wants to bring a raya from a brisa that gave him aim, you're not allowed to marry each one his brother's wife. Toshma, Shnei Achim Tiomin. Gerin. Oh, now we have twins that are Gerin. And V'chein Mishuchrarim, or two Avodim that are Mishuchrarim. Now, after the Gerus, or after the Shichrur, they each married, and now one of them died without children. V'ein chayovin mishum eshes ach. Right, because again, gerkshin is gar kodesh nolada. Hoysa hora sam shalo b'kedusha v'lei dasim b'kedusha. So that would mean that the gerus of the mother took place after she was already pregnant. And now she gives birth to two boys, let's say. So first of all, she got pregnant. Then she was misguided, and then she gave birth. And now each one of these gerim marry a wife, and one dies without children, is lo choltzim lo miyab. Aval chayovim mishum eshes ach. Whoa, this is a breakthrough. He's saying that even though Horasa Shalobik Ducha, nevertheless they are considered brothers, not for Chalitza and Yibum, but for Eshes Ach. Why? Because Eshes Ach is radically different than Yibum. Yibum all depends, it breaks down to one element, and that's Ach Min Ach, which they don't have, they gave it. But in the case of Erva, the Erva is applicable to Ach Min Ach. That's not the same as Yibum. So you have two brothers with the same mother, they can't marry each other's wives. That would be Eshes Ach. So if he would have a relationship with his brother's wife, he's now chayav for Eshes Ach. Hoysa horasa. If after she was miscarried, then she became pregnant, or after the shichur, then she became pregnant, it's Hareim ki Yisrael l'chol divrei. Which means even for you. So now what's the proof from this brisa? Tani miyas, ein chayovin mishum eshes ach. So the Gemara's being medayik. So we're talking about a case of leidasam, horasam vileidasam shelo b'kedusha. And what does the brisa say in such a case? It says, Ein chayovin mishum eshes ach. Why? Because it was horasan shelo b'kedusha. So the Gemara is medayik. Chiyuva leka. In So if I'm not mistaken, we're going back to the ratio of the Bryce. Because what does it mean, Shnei Achim Ta'omim Gerim? Maybe we didn't emphasize this point. Shnei Achim Ta'omim Gerim. I think means that they're just Gerim. Mamish Poshut Gerim. You have two twin brothers, Dick and Harry, and they're going. Now they're misguided. So this is a case of Horas over Leidos Shlomi Kedush. And the Brisa says, to our surprise, Lo Choltzim Lo Miyabed. I mean, that goes without saying. And then it says, Ein Chayov Mitzumei Shesach. What do you mean, Ein Chayov Mitzumei Shesach? They're not brothers at all. And you're implying that there's no chiyuv of Shesach. Chiyuv deleka ha'isura ika. If you turn to Daf Chav Ches. So what kind of isur is this? Must be an isur d'Rabbanan. Meaning that you're not allowed to marry the wife of your brother when you're not brothers at all. Gerim are not brothers. So you see clearly that the Rabbanan were worried that if we would allow two brothers each to marry each other's wife, they look like brothers because they're twins and they were both Miskayer, then you'll come to be Mater Shesach in Yisrael. So this is clear-cut proof that even Gerim that are Achim in Ha'em is also l'kolecha mehem loses as Eishes Chavera. And the Gemara rejects who adid afilu isur nami leka. Fi aidi de boil misnei seifa. So really, when it says that ein chayavim, right? What was the language here? Ein chayavim mishumei shesach, but really it means mutarim mishumei shesach. And afilu isur nami leka. So there's no issue to marry your brother's wife. Right, in the case where we know that they are achim in our name, and they're completely achim, totally achim, and chayav mishumei shesach. And why? Because it was leidos and b'kedusha. It's therefore tonanami reisha ein chayavim. So in truth, there's no isur d'Rabbanan for them to marry Eishes Achim. But the reason why they use the language of einam chayavim is because of the sefer. And the sefer, he wants to mechadish that aval chayavim, that they would be chayav karis b'shumeishes ach, because they're achim gemurim l'chol davar, because they will lay dasan b'kedush. Omar Rava,